if you are totally committed to one of these two ideologies, and you really don't want to accept any part of the narrative of the other, then this is not a discussion for you. You think that eventually you will rule, and you can rule, and you will have the power to negate the other totally. I think this is a discussion for those who genuinely care about peace, genuinely care about human beings, who are open to new ideas and new discussions, and who are willing to in some way accommodate the other rather than negate and totally disenfranchise the other in their way of doing things. I again think that both movements are in crisis right now, and that this is a good time for people to start thinking out of the box and to start moving beyond the current impasse. Basically, this book that I wrote, it's a very slim volume, can be quickly read in 2 or 3 hours, really has 3 parts. The first part, I basically explain why the two-state solution is no longer possible at all, even if the parties desired it. It no longer can serve as the basis for a solution. The second is I present my vision for a totally alternative approach to the whole situation, which I hope commends itself to people of goodwill on both sides and to the international community as an alternative to the two-state paradigm. And the third, very, very, very thin chapter of a couple of pages or so, which would be, I think, the most interesting part for this group, is how do we move towards that solution? What are the obstacles? What are the what program of action can flow out of our position once we agree that the two-state paradigm doesn't work? And basically, the approach I took, and I started thinking about it, I think, around when I was asked to speak at the anniversary, the centennial anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. I was supposed to speak to the Jewish Historical Society in New York. And I was disinvited a week before because people on the board didn't want to hear what I had to say and asked to be disinvited. And so I gave the same speech at a church nearby. And that was the basis for this book, basically. So I was speaking to a group of Zionists, not necessarily left-wingers or anti-Zionists or allies and supporters of Palestinians, but, you know, Zionists who still had a sense of history and who could look at the larger picture. And basically, I told them that for all the advantages in its favor, the Zionist movement, after 100 years of the Balfour Declaration, was really at a crisis no less than the Palestinian national movement, that it had failed to accomplish its goal. Because I understood Zionism to want a Jewish state, as Jewish as France is French. And they went to great lengths towards that goal. They captured all of historic Palestine. They built a modern state that was extremely powerful militarily, but financially, technologically, in many ways, really a country that that was a very successful country that had tremendous support, particularly of many people in Western Europe, but also of the United States. But that its central theme of making it as Jewish as France is French, uh, it had not succeeded in. I contrasted that with the Palestinian national movement, which was really totally in disarray, totally powerless, physically fragmented into different categories of Palestinians, all of them subject in one form or another to Israeli control and supervision and direction. Nonetheless, they retained the essence of their uh, nationalist movement, which I summarize by the phrases Palestine Arabiya. Palestine is Arab. Palestine is Arab, meaning it is an Arab entity, part of the Arab world. They speak Arabic. They want liberation. They want decolonization. They want self-determination. They're part of the national movement for liberation throughout the world, and they view the Zionist movement as a settler colonial movement, totally foreign and totally illegitimate and illegal in their terms. So I state that these two movements have been locked in a zero-sum situation, where one advance by one of the two movements is a loss to the other, and any improvement in the fortunes, life, number of one movement is a loss to the other. I also state that in 1967, an opportunity came for a compromise between these two movements, a geographic compromise. We will split the country very unfairly, in my view, that Israel within the borders of 1967 remains to be Israel, a predominantly Jewish place, but that the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza should be turned into a Palestinian state with a corridor between them, with some security arrangements to keep it demilitarized, with some provision for sharing Jerusalem. But basically, that is the essence of a two-state solution. And for many, many years, that was basically the only game in town. That's what decent people throughout the world and on both sides really supported. That the Israelis, the Zionists, will keep basically 78% of Palestine, historic Palestine, and the Palestinians will make do with the remaining 22% and somehow make a state out of it for their national movement. This paradigm broke down primarily over the settler movement. The settler movement was represented itself as being the true Zionists. This land is ours. Why can't we live everywhere in it? Why can't we set up within the occupied territories? In the beginning, it was enclaves that are truly Jewish and truly Zionists. Not only Israeli Arabs are allowed there. We have the power, we can do it. Yes, it's against international law, but who cares? We have the power, and the United States will shield us from the consequences of international law and international opinion. So as the settlers grew and grew and the settlements grew, they pretty much swallowed up the bulk of the West Bank, leaving the Arab areas being enclaves within basically Jewish control and domination. In fact, for the last at least 50 years or so, the struggle for peace and justice and reconciliation and possibility of peace was basically a struggle against settlements and their expansion. In the book, I point out that that battle basically has been lost. That Israel has succeeded in creating, even within the occupied territories, a structure that both physically, psychologically, legally, infrastructurally, in every way, is both separate from and dominant to the surrounding Arab areas, and at the same time fully integrated into the Israeli body politic in a way that can no longer be separated. So I say, if that paradigm breaks down, where do we go from here? And the solution that I proposed, or the vision that I suggested, required a very painful restructuring of the two movements and the two ideologies in a way that addresses the needs of each party, while at the same time giving up the claim of exclusivity. So I did something of a thought experiment. I say, why do Jews want a Jewish state? What does a Jewish state give them? What does Zionism offer them in the Jewish state? And can we give them all these things that they require without exclusivity, without cutting out, negating the Palestinian Arabs? And by the same token, what is it that Palestinian nationalism promises or offers to Palestinians? What is it they really want? And can a new form of state offer them all these things that they want without exclusivity, without negating, demonizing, disenfranchising, eliminating, getting rid of all those settlers who came and took over their land? And I said that it is possible, but it requires a restructuring and a rethinking of Zionism, and a restructuring and a rethinking of Palestinian nationalism. I deal with some of the objections to this, still talking as a thought experiment, still apart from whether we can actually do it, just still as a thought experiment. And there were some very legitimate objections, which I try to deal with. One of them is what I call the demographic demon. Can we get rid of it? Can we really explain to people that a society can be democratic and can, in fact, run without necessarily demanding a 51% demographic majority? That, in fact, it often happens that minorities can live, survive, and thrive in a genuinely pluralistic society. That it is possible to have a society, and in fact, I also argue the opposite, that it is not possible to have a society that totally ignores, quashes, and oppresses substantial minorities in its structure. That sooner or later, this either leads to civil war or secession. That in fact, we need to and can structure a society that addresses the needs of substantial minorities within its framework. I also deal with some very specific objections or specific fears or specific claims by both sides to say that they should really consider this this alternative, and it's a very I would say difficult argument because people are locked into the paradigm of the nation state, where a dominant group says, this is my state. This is France, should be French. As France, as French as France is the term I keep using. That people are caught up in this idea that if you're going to be democratic at all, the majority has to determine the outcome in its favor and has to dominate the structures of power within that organization. So I also deal with some other objection that enmities have been going on for a long time, and you can't expect enemies to become friends. And I say that's nonsense. Enemies can become friends, can become allies, can coexist, can live together, and there are many examples throughout history. I like to give them the example of Germany and France, who just a couple of generations back were killing each other by the millions, totally destroying each other's countries. And today they are totally the best of friends. I always mention that I was watching an advertisement on television for a German car, and they used the French tune, and nobody thought anything of it. It's just normal. It just fit the particular car that they were trying to sell. And how can you do that when just 50, 70 years ago you were killing each other by the millions? And the enmity between Palestinian Arabs and Jews is not really historic, unlike what sometimes is claimed. I tried to also deal with this idea that that Arabs somehow, or Muslims, or people in the Middle East cannot deal with each other as civilized people. That this is a dangerous neighborhood. That somehow this may be good for Westerners and Europeans, but that other races or other cultures cannot accept the idea of tolerance and coexistence, which is, of course, a very racist idea and simply not true. I was also trying to deal with the idea that there is no model. So anyway, I also offered a few sort of creative ideas of how one would deal with the Zionist, I would call it obsession with security as a result of their history, as a result of the Holocaust, as a result of anti-Semitism, and how can we address that particular fear and trauma in a genuinely one-state solution. Because most people who think of one state think, eventually the Arabs will become a majority if they're not already a majority. And where would that leave Jews who are basically fared very badly when they were not in full power and control? I gave two new ideas that would sort of go towards addressing those security fears. One of them was a constitutional structure that would preserve their rights regardless of whether they are a minority or not, regardless of who's in the majority or the minority, and therefore prevent a 51% majority from basically oppressing their minorities. I also wanted to preserve for them certain privileges in the field of security by saying, why don't we agree up front that the defense minister, the head of the Air Force, Navy, Army, and nuclear, whatever you have, will always be Jewish with an Arab deputy, but every other position in the army will be open to everybody on the basis of merit. And the head of the police will always be a Palestinian Arab with a Jewish deputy in terms of day-to-day interaction with citizens. I also suggested that at least 10% of the defense budget will always be spent by a special ministry for cooperation and tolerance that aids removing the hatred and the sense of injustice and the sense of enmity that has grown over the years. Because I argue that the real security threats to Israeli Jews today doesn't come from Iran or Turkey or some foreign army that's about to invade them, but it comes from a 12-year-old schoolgirl with a pair of scissors in her pocket who's determined to do something about it and to address the sense of injustice by stabbing a soldier or a settler or some Israeli. I also argue that we need to bring into the picture, bring into the conversation two important groups without whom there can be no peace. One of them are the Jewish settlers who have been demonized and at least internationally kept out of the discussion for peace. And today they are basically dominant. They are the ones who determine Israeli policies towards Palestinians, particularly in the occupied territories. And we cannot ignore them and keep them out of the discussion because they can and do claim to be the true Zionists, the true pioneers, the true practitioners of what Zionism is all about. And they say, why are we illegitimate in Hebron and you're legitimate in West Jerusalem and in Haifa, and where you are actually living in an Arab's home after having ethnically cleansed them? Why are you saying you can live there and we can't live here? Whatever historic, religious, existential excuses there are for Zionism in Israel itself certainly apply to us settlers in the West Bank. And the second group that I think needs to be brought into the conversation definitely is Hamas. You cannot talk about Gaza today without talking about Hamas. And you cannot talk about peace in Palestine without bringing Hamas into the discussion and into the equation. These are two of the steps that I suggest to deal with, that we need to deal with if we are genuinely interested in making peace in the Holy Land. Now, I recognize that this is a very difficult conversation, both for Palestinians, certainly, and for Jewish Israelis, for different reasons. For Palestinians, this is like unfair. This is our country. These people came from all over and they are pushing us out. How can we abandon our demand, our claim for a statehood? Why can't we have a state like other people? Why can't we? Uh, why do we have to share this with foreigners who really are not entitled to be here in the first place? And from the Zionist side says, why should we? We are powerful. We won. And we need this place, and we why should we give up? Why should we share this with anybody else when we have all the power to control and to keep it for ourselves? I tried. I started by saying that one of the I started thinking in this vein when I was speaking at the synagogue, or was supposed to be speaking at the synagogue. And I told my Zionist audience that from the Palestinian point of view, your claims are totally spurious. They really don't stand up. You say religiously every year, once a year, we say next year in Jerusalem. I thought that, well, for Muslims, 5 times every single day, they turn towards Mecca to pray. Does that give them national, physical, political rights in Saudi Arabia and in its oil wealth? The fact that you have a religious connection to a place doesn't mean that you can go over and take it over and deny it to others. And historical claims, I mean, really, this is the heart of the Middle East, between Europe, Asia, and Africa. So every empire in the world has had its chance to occupy and to rule and to have a state in that part of the land. And I could name 10 or 15 countries today who ruled Palestine for more than 100 or 150 years, that the Jews ruled under Solomon and David. You can have Italy, Greece, Ethiopia, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, England. No, not England. England didn't have any claims there. But you can have a number of states who say, well, we used to rule that part of the world for hundreds of years. Turkey, certainly. That kind of historical claim, I think, again, is not enough. But I said, this is the reality of the Middle East. And rather than argue the merits of each side, who has more rights, of these two ideologies, these two movements, these two groups, can we find a way to accommodate both of them? Can we really think forward? And I want to add one last point before I open it for discussion, because I suspect the discussion is what's going to be really interesting in this meeting. And that is this. If you are totally committed to one of these two ideologies, and you really don't want to accept any part of the narrative of the other, then this is not a discussion for you. You think that eventually you will rule, and you can rule, and you will have the power to negate the other totally. I think this is a discussion for those who genuinely care about peace, genuinely care about human beings, who are open to new ideas and new discussions, and who are willing to in some way accommodate the other rather than negate and totally disenfranchise the other in their way of doing things. I again think that both movements are in crisis right now, and that this is a good time for people to start thinking out of the box and to start moving beyond the current impasse. And so with that, I think I will stop and leave it for questions and open the discussion.